Can I hand it to you?
Yes.
Good morning from Julia's Cafe and Books in South Charlotte, where we're drinking fantastic Magnolia coffee, the local Charlotte. Delicious.
It's really good today.
I feel it kicking in. And you know something? I'm going to need it because Alan and I have a guest. Actually, we are Roman's guests, so I'm going to put him in charge. He contacted us, as some of you might know. And I'm just going to hand it over to him because he's got the tough questions. We're going to do a deep dive. I'm scared. Jumping in the deep end. So Alan, can you tell us a little bit about yourself? I mean, this is your crowd, and I'm sort of.
Yeah. You're talking about me.
I'm talking. No, I meant Roman. I'm sorry.
Oh yeah.
So go ahead.
Yeah. Do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah. Well, I'm a journalist with Creative Loafing Charlotte and freshman class of 2023 at Northwestern University's in the Dill School of Journalism. So it's really an honor to be here today with these two guys, some of the most interesting candidates I've ever met in North Carolina's U.S. District 9 House special election. All right, let's get started.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
My first question has to do with Ilhan Omar, who's been generating a lot of controversy recently. This week, the Alabama State GOP actually passed a resolution that urges the expulsion of Ilhan Omar from the House for making controversial remarks against Israel. The resolution condemned her for what it called her, quote, disturbing record of anti-Semitic language that includes alleging Jewish money is used to buy American influence regarding its policy towards Israel, as well as her support for BDS, boycotts, investment, and sanctions. Citing Article 1, Section 5 of the Constitution, Republicans argued that there's a constitutional basis for expelling members of the government who are disloyal to the United States. Is it true that there's a constitutional basis for this? And if so, is it fair and ethical to do so? Jeff?
Yes, since I am a constitutional scholar in my spare time, don't laugh, Alan. This is a difficult issue, and I confess that I did have to go to Wikipedia to look at some of the history of this. I thought it might be true, but I wanted to be certain. So it is true that there are grounds for expulsion in the Congress, and most of it is related to corruption and bribery. And just looking over the past 20 or 30 years, a couple of members have been expelled and related to the ab scandal, Pennsylvania, I think Myers. And then also Trafficant from Ohio, who one of the Libertarians who's running in District 3 worked for way back when. That was his first foray into politics, working in Trafficante's office. So he would know the answer to this without actually looking it up on Wikipedia like I did. So the answer to the first part is yes, and I think Al and I probably agree on that. It's just a simple thing. It stands to reason that if a voting body votes to expel somebody, that they can do that, and it is there in Article 5, right? So that's possible. Now, Alan, do you have anything you'd like to add to that?
I mean, just because I did the same research too, because I had no idea. I was like, this is, I don't know if they can actually do this. It sounds like, so just so I'm understanding what happened, the Alabama State Legislature, is that right, passed a resolution calling on their congressional delegation to start the proceedings. Right. And, there are instances, I think if you look at disloyalty to the U.S., the closest thing to modern day that I can find was happened in the 1700s, I think. Somebody was stoking violence between two Native American tribes, against Britain.
Oh, right. The Creek and the Cherokee.
Right.
Yeah, that's right. That's fascinating.
Let's talk about the case of Ilhan Omar.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
Is there a case to be made against Ilhan Omar?
Well, the last, again, just going back to the research that we did, the last actual attempted disloyalty expulsion was Robert La Follette, which is one of the most prominent senators in U.S. history, and he's an icon of Wisconsin politics. He actually ran as a third-party candidate back in, and the reason for his disloyalty was that he opposed the entry into the First World War. So there you go. People who are not towing the line for war are accused of disloyalty. Gee, things haven't changed very much, have they? so that's pretty striking fact on its own. Alan, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's a great segue into Ilhan and Omar because, and I went in last night and I looked at the quotes that they pull oftentimes in the media are taken out of context quite a bit, I think. And so if you look at what she's saying, in many cases, she's talking about the challenges that she and other members of Congress who happen to be Muslim face in the situation where anything you say that could be construed in some way critical of Israel's foreign policies, their domestic policies, comes across as being anti-Semitic. There's also that notion that there's some sort of dual allegiance kind of criticism between the two countries, and that often it's like a dog whistle for anti-Semitism, which I don't agree with. I don't think that is grounds for disloyalty. I think that that's kind of a wonderful thing that we can bring these things up in conversation.
That's right. Alan and I are pretty much in agreement on this. I mean, we could make other statements about how blind loyalty to any party or any country or any movement is pretty self-destructive, because you know the loyalty really has to be earned. I mean, just on an ethical basis, you can't be loyal. You can't be loyal just for the sake of being loyal.
To me, it's disturbing that with Israel's history of human rights abuses and discrimination against Palestinians, Republicans are making it as if it's almost impossible to call out. So
that's true, and I think both the Libertarian Party and the Green Party, as far as I know, are pretty much in line with the idea that we can criticize foreign governments, even though we don't necessarily want to intervene in their affairs. In the case of Israel, I think it's pretty clear that we're not allies. There is no piece of paper indicating that our Congress or our executive branch has any kind of formal alliance with them. I mean, they have been in a state of sort of perpetual war and aggression since the 40s. So I don't know if we want to create an alliance. I don't think Americans want to fight for that. And I do believe that the phrase I used previously was, yes, they're friends, but they're friends with an anger management problem. And so you want to be very careful with your relationship. And Ilhan Omar is absolutely right to say that they have a lot of influence in this country. And even Bernie says, look, it's not anti-Semitic to criticize the right-wing government of Israel. You know, so we're pretty much in line with a lot of liberal American Jews who just say, look, enough is enough. And I think that's sort of generally true of my party.
Yeah, and ours too, I believe.
Yeah.
And to add one more thing to this, just looking at it from another angle, not so much the substance of Ilhan Omar's comments or this idea that she could be expelled from Congress, but I would encourage people to look at the Alabama GOP, because what you often see happen is these groups do these things that are very sensationalistic,
right,
to drum up financial support, to drum up political support for upcoming elections. And so this may have no basis whatsoever, but it gets people riled up and it gets them to the polls. And most importantly, it gets them to donate money to the Alabama GOP. So I'd be interested to see their FEC filings going forward after this, to see if this was just a smokescreen to collect money.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with that. Is there anything else you'd like to add on this question?
I think Alan's absolutely right. In my opinion, such a political stunt of that nature really jeopardizes the idea of American democracy. I mean, you can't always be talking about expelling a Congress member. And this goes for sometimes for members of the left as well. You can't always be talking about impeaching President Trump,
right,
without first addressing your arguments. They make almost no attempt to address, there's almost no attempt to actually address Ilhan Omar's argument. They want on the face people to believe that it's anti-Semitism, when it's much more complicated story.
That's right. And even
I think we need to move on to the next question.
Yeah, sure.
Next question is about the Green New Deal. So as you may probably know, Democratic candidate Bernie Sanders unveiled his $16.3 trillion plan to launch, quote, a decade of the Green New Deal. This would be a 10-year federal, quote, mobilization that would factor climate change into every policy action from immigration to foreign policy, while promising to create 20 million jobs in the process. However, the thing is the US doesn't currently have 20 million unemployed people. So this plan would either require taking in more immigrants or moving some Americans from their current jobs to work in the Green New Deal jobs. Would this be good for the welfare and economic prospects of America? And is it necessary to combat climate change? Or does it set the stage for corruption and misuse of funds? Alan, I'll let you answer.
So to answer your question, both, I think. So I think it's great for the economy. I support the Green New Deal. The Green Party actually came up with the Green New Deal 10 years ago, and we've been running it in our platform in gubernatorial campaigns and, of course, in presidential campaigns. We have a few issues over some of the changes that the Democrats have made to the Green New Deal as it was originally proposed. We favor more of an eco-socialist Green New Deal, whereas theirs is kind of embedded in green capitalist principles and things. So there are some minor differences of opinion that we have there. By and large, I think it's a great thing. It's going to transform our infrastructure. It's going to create these jobs. And to your point, we don't have 20 million. What was it? 20 million unemployed people.
Yeah.
Right. So a lot of people are currently employed in industries that their jobs are going to go away as we transition off of fossil fuels. That's one thing. The second thing is there's going to be new people entering the job market over the next decade that are going to need jobs. And the third thing is that there are certain people who are employed in industries right now whose we did some coffee.
Barista rebellion.
There we go. It's the feds.
Yeah.
So
they're all over.
There are people who are currently employed in certain industries who are going to be able to transition into Green New Deal jobs. And those workplaces are going to be much more better for them because at least under the Green Party's Green New Deal, these are democratized workplaces where workers actually have more of a say in the way that their workplace runs, as opposed to traditional corporate structures where management is very much a top-down structure where people don't have financial stability because they don't have any control over their jobs. So I see that as a good thing. To the second point in your question, yeah, it totally sets the stage for corruption. And anytime you have these huge bureaucracies, they're ripe for corruption. And this is something that Jeff and I have talked about quite a bit. The Green Party, and I think that's an important distinction between our Green New Deal and possibly the Democrats' Green New Deal, we are very much about decentralization of power. So we want to see the federally funded programs that are administered at the state and local level as a general rule. So to the extent that we can do it, to have these decentralized workplaces where Green New Deal jobs exist, that's going to be much better than something where you have sort of a federal agency that oversees job creation and things like that. I'll give it over to Jeff because I've been talking quite a bit.
That's very interesting. Not exactly the answer I was expecting, but great answer. Jeff?
Oh, Alan, there you go again. So this clearly is a big division between Alan and I and the Libertarian Party and the Green Party. Just as a reminder, on my Facebook account page, you can read some of the things I wrote about this topic starting in the really in the early 90s about the way that corporations are governed. Now, I'm certainly not an apologist for corporations, but I am in favor of the corporate form. So the first thing that sticks out at me in your question is this requirement to factor in what specifically climate change into every policy action. Now, part of the corruption that Alan identifies is, the DHS and Border Patrol and the Defense Department sort of hijacking climate change as a national security issue in order to get more funds and do things that they might have otherwise done anyway, whether it's moving bases or getting more climate change friendly equipment or being able to pay for the to clean up the pollution that they created anyway, right? So that's one part of it. But moving back to this topic of corporate governance, to me, the Green New Deal really goes to kind of the heart of capitalism. And so Alan and I also have this discussion about capitalism versus socialism. And while I agree that corporate malfeasance is a very serious issue, and in particular the resource wars that we've been engaged in, and the takeover of really our national security policy for the purpose of expanding our footprint around the world to gather these resources, primarily oil, but other resources. I mean, in the case of Greenland, for example, they're talking about the so-called rare earths there. I hope we don't invade Greenland, but I think that making that change is, for Bernie and other Green New Dealers, I think is really a bridge too far. And I don't know how to explain this in a short amount of time, but sort of factoring in all those decisions at the boardroom really is like, the best analogy I can come up with is, three people trying to decide what movie they want to go to. It's like, well, you got to factor in the fact that I don't like to see violent movies, and for Roman, it's like, I'm only going to see, I only want romantic comedies, and for Alan, it's like saying, I only want to see a movie that's got a strong social message. So we can't even agree on that. So the way the boardrooms operate at the high levels, I think this would put too much power into already powerful CEOs. Now, if we had Ralph Nader sitting here, he would be turning blue, and he would be, practically spitting in my face, saying, corporate abuse is the big problem, the way they're running, the way they're getting their money. And I don't disagree that there are these massive abuses, but I do think that there is a market for assets. There is a market for labor. There is a market for high-level professional labor and professional management, and that those goals do have to be harmonized, right? So libertarianism is nothing without its theory of how people get along in the market system, using the price system, using bidding for assets and bidding for labor and international commerce and competition. And so I think so this plan would put a dagger in that, which is why I oppose it.
Could the market alone really complete the transition away from fossil fuels that Bernie Sanders is talking about? Because this technology's been around for a long time. A lot of fuel sources, algae, sugar,
right.
There's even water-based cars, but it's hard to implement because there's sort of capital that's already invested in fossil fuel infrastructure. So how are you going to buy, a clean energy car if there was no clean energy gas stations? It seems to me that there needs to be some kind of collective push towards the transition.
Well, technology changes, progress marches on without the big thumb of government on the scale. I simply think that, I think this is like an expression of what I call American vanity or American conceptualism, that we can embark on these big, large-scale programs. And I don't think historically they work out too well. I do think that if there are competitive technologies, that they do need to stand the market test. It can't be that engineers and scientists try to tell us what's good for us, and then the government imposes those solutions on us, because they do have to pass the market test. Now, oil, is there is the finger on or the thumb on the scale to benefit oil. And so I totally oppose that. I totally oppose the corruption that's engendered by that. There should be vigorous competition. People who, like Alan and myself, who think that we'd like to move away from using gasoline all the time, even though it's a fantastic product for my lawnmower and my weed whacker, and my car. Yeah. But we'd like alternatives to that. If there were low cost alternatives, whether that's nuclear, wind, solar, bat guano, whatever the case is, if you can find something that's better, it's just the better mousetrap principle, in my view. But I've been babbling.
Anything else
No. I mean, I think that kind of explains the distinction between us really well. I think.
Next, I want to talk about one case of actual corruption that happened when a government did try to push a nation forward with energy investment. And this happened in Brazil. It's called Operation Car Wash. And there was basically a gigantic misuse of funds, huge billions and trillions of dollars in bribes paid out to members of Congress, the president, a president and former president. And this led to a good deal of anger in Brazil and basically a voter backlash where they voted a right-wing candidate called Jair Bolsonaro. And now this is more complicated because some elements of the right misconstrued or overstated the levels of corruption in an effort to rile up public anger. But basically, Jair Bolsonaro is a right-wing candidate who's rebelling against the standard protective state in Brazil. And he gave the open thumbs up, to farmers and ranchers and landowners to cut down trees in the Amazon and burn the Amazon for cattle ranching, which is a form of corruption in itself. Now, Bernie Sanders, if elected president, said he would consider sanctioning Brazil for the government's environmental mismanagement. Would that be an ethical response to protect a world precious natural resource, or is it an unfair sanction against an economy trying to fix itself? Let you start, Jeff.
Sure. Jair Bolsonaro, is that how you pronounce his name? Obviously, I'm not an expert in Brazilian politics, but I will say that sanctions, I oppose the use of sanctions unless they are related to an impending war and unless Congress approves them. So for Bernie to wave around the threat of sanctions is not a very peaceful solution in my estimation. And people in the Green Party and progressives in the Democratic Party, I think, would be well served to ask the question if they get an opportunity. Would Bernie really be running around operating from the executive level as a guy who's imposing sanctions on other countries for doing things that are ostensibly legal, but which are may be grounded in corruption?
Okay. Let's not think so much about how the sanctions are imposed, but suppose if Congress were willing to pass sanctions, would that be a good decision? I'll give it to Alan.
Okay.
Well, you want to continue?
Well, it's Roman's show, so he can direct us any way he likes. So you're on the spot.
Okay. So I will say, so this is an interesting issue.
Yeah.
When we think about sanctions specifically, because the Green Party, in their platform, we support media, right? So boycotting, divestment, and sanctions. What I will say is it's important for us to not necessarily go about affecting change in the world unilaterally just by throwing our weight around, whether that's military weight or economic weight. Because something I know that Jeff and I have talked about at length on previous shows is this idea that we can use our economic power to essentially starve populations of people and throw entire nations into chaos because of their economic reliance on the U.S. So I think that there is an ethical, moral issue here beyond simply stepping in and doing what we think is right as Americans. With that in mind, I do think that sanctions and boycotting and divestment, those are more peaceful solutions to problems than going in with our military to overthrow governments and things like that. I think there's probably an even better way to go about it if we can loop in other countries on this. If it's a world resource, the rainforest, then we need to have other countries in there helping us make these decisions about how we want to go in and help protect it.
Just to remember, the Amazon rainforest produces 20% of the world's oxygen. So if this were destroyed, climate change would worsen. We would lose countless possible cures because of the medical value of plants in the Amazon rainforest. We lose countless species. And there's so much value that the rainforest creates for us that Brazilian activists have stated that it's not just Brazil's resource, because when you chop down the forest, it harms the whole world.
Well, look at this shows that the current fires are not as bad as 2005, and they're not above like a 15-year average. So this has been going on for quite a while. One thing I don't understand, and I'm just going to have to look this up later, is in California, when we have fires, they always talk about whether they're contained or not. 10%, 20%, and it's not clear to me whether these fires are being done in a controlled fashion or not. They've got a right to do with their public lands what they have a right to do. Again, if we want more trees to suck up, CO2, we can go on massive planting binges around the world if we think that that's one of the solutions to climate change. I just don't, and I want to make a distinction between private sanctions and public sanctions, because people who are listening to this might not be familiar with the fact that, the government, through the United States Treasury, through the Office of Foreign Asset Control, sanctions a lot of people and accounts around the world, watches their financial transactions, and goes after alleged terrorists. You can never get off these lists, right? But the idea that you can impose private sanctions, like, I don't want to travel to Brazil because I don't like what their government's doing. I don't want to travel to Israel and give them my tourist dollars because I don't like what they're doing. I don't want to travel to Great Britain because I don't like what they're doing to Julian Assange. So that's kind of a private boycott, very similar to a sanction. But what we oppose, generally speaking, is the use of large public sanctions on the order of magnitude that Bernie here is talking about. So
very interesting response. Let's move on to the next question. I'm going to pivot a little bit to talk more about a domestic issue, but also an issue that's coming up in countries worldwide, which is workers' rights under the gig economy and working conditions as the economy shifts from stable long-term jobs to more gig jobs, like Uber, Postmates. These gig economy jobs have recently come under a lot of fire for what people are calling unfair labor practices. For example, stealing tips, not paying minimum wage, and unfair and arbitrary firings. The company DoorDash, for example, came under fire because it was discovered that DoorDash was appropriating its users' tips and using it to pay their wage. So they weren't really getting their tips. But what the company did was they said, okay, your tips will go towards your wage, which you're already earning anyway. So really, it's just sort of a backdoor way for the company to not have to pay the wage to their employees themselves. I myself work for Postmates, which is a delivery service for food, and it is a good way to earn a little extra money in your spare time. Gives me much more freedom to use my time how I wish. But however, there is a lot of concern about workers' rights being a gig worker. For example, these apps track where you go, and they track your ratings that you get from customers. So if you get an unfair rating from a customer, say if your customer is being misogynistic or racist, then you kind of still have to deal with it because you need their rating. And if you get a bad rating, there's no way to reverse that. If your rating goes below 4.7, in most cases, you can lose your job. So how do we deal with these kind of issues that are coming up with the gig economy? Should we allow collective bargaining, extend minimum wage protections and federal regulations to get to the gig economy? Or are these just necessary problems that people have to deal with? I'll let Alan go.
So it's interesting because normally when I think about collective bargaining, it's with respect to traditional jobs, right? Not necessarily gigs, because in these instances, are you considered an independent contractor, like a 1099 contractor? Yeah, so it's interesting in that sense because in a lot of ways you could potentially group together to to work with other contractors and use that group force to force Postmates or DoorDash or any of these companies to change their ways. I mean, that's one way that you can put pressure on those companies. I know that the Green Party, and then also I am for collective bargaining of workers, especially in traditional jobs that are where you would be considered an employee of the company and not necessarily a 1099 contractor. So it's a really tricky situation, especially when it comes to gigs. I think that the fact that we have a gig economy is indicative of something bigger at play here. If people are not making living wages at one job, if they have to have two jobs or have to have a job and a gig to make things work, I think that workers kind of banding together to bargain collectively is always better, whether you have it through a union or whether you do it independently of a union among several contractors.
And with the issue of arbitrary firing, for example, if you're an Uber driver and you're a woman and the man you're driving is being inappropriate or doing sexual harassment, like how do you report this to there's currently no mechanism to report this to the company, because to sign up to be an Uber driver, you never meet with an Uber manager. There's not even for Postmates, there's not even like a link to report that the customer was being abusive. So how do we solve this sort of this issue of working without a boss?
Yeah.
That presents.
Well, I'm happy to jump in. I don't know how to resolve a lot of these specific problems that people have very specifically with certain companies. I know personally, I've been in the job market for 45 years. I was a gig person when I first started out, and then I had a long-term job, and then I became a contractor consultant. And believe me, these contracts that I've been working with over time have gotten increasingly difficult for contractors. So I do believe that the power is in the hands of these corporations and large banks, and they're very unfavorable. Do I know how to resolve it? I do know that, if someone was, asking me about what they should do, whether they should leave their job because they were unhappy or for whatever reason they didn't like the way it was managed, well, I would say it's kind of crass, but it's just, you gotta move on. You gotta get out of bad situations, and it just means that your only true power is the power to walk away. And the thing about these contracts is, even when you sign them, they can be sort of altered over time. There are some economies around the world that have something like tenure, where you've got a job and you really have this job for life, but those are areas with a lot of very high unemployment, and it creates a lot of barriers for people. We know that there's I was in a car with an attorney who had just come back from lecturing in France, and he talked about employees getting fired, and they looked around at one another and they didn't really know what that meant. A lot of these students, they were saying, we don't have they didn't understand that because their idea of being in a job, and certainly a job in public service or a job with a big corporation, is kind of like a tenured professor position. So this was many years ago, and I hope I didn't botch that story, but that's the way a lot of people think about their jobs, and there is a great inequality in bargaining. So I do believe, I guess, just to get to the heart of the question here, of course I believe in collective bargaining. Then the question becomes, how well can you cooperate with management to make sure everybody is happy? How are your complaints assessed? What protections are there for you if you're a whistleblower? If you're the squeaky wheel that's always saying, I need a more comfortable chair, or the white guy got the August vacation, but I only had to take the July vacation, and I'm a woman of color, So there are all kinds of these crazy disputes that aren't in the job place, that just aren't subject to comprehensive solutions. They're just not subject to litigation. It's not clear to me that we can come up with rules. This is about, the job market is frequently just about splitting the difference. Like, you don't like your job at Uber because somebody hassled you and you couldn't get your complaint through to the management. So management is really unresponsive to your needs. Well, your answer is to either just suck it up or walk away, right? So that's kind of the harsh realities of the job place. And I hate to sound too much like a stern daddy on this problem, but we have to think of the job market the way it is, not the way we'd like it to be. So
I would just add one thing to this, to say that I don't believe this is a problem that government in and of itself can necessarily solve through policy. And I'll give you an example of why. So in the state of California, they passed a law for basically it's a waiver of claims that you sign if you leave a company, if you're fired or something like that. They passed a law that said that you cannot waive your right to a claim that you don't know about. And so that's great for workers because it means that, if you leave your company and then you later find out that, there's a class action lawsuit, you can join it, things like that. So they passed that law so that can protect workers. But now what does every business do to that separation contract? They add a clause in that says, I'm aware of this right that I have, and I'm also waiving that right. And so you can't just have the government putting pressure on employers. You need to have workers coming together, collectively bargaining to put that pressure. It's not something the government can solve in and of itself.
That's right. And so just to go back to that imbalance of power, I definitely agree that that's there, and I definitely agree that I don't like it because I've had to sign contracts where I got to give them 2 weeks notice, but they don't need to give me 2 weeks notice. So being an at-will employee in the private sector is very difficult.
I want to take this opportunity to segue into the next question because that brings up a related issue, which is the idea of a universal basic income to address some of the issues created by the modern economy. We're past the age where you can just work at the whole factory your whole life and know for sure that you're going to get retirement benefits and have the same job forever. Now, these days, it's more common for millennials just to switch to various jobs throughout their career. And while this has benefits, it also creates a lot more uncertainty. With automation, it's created a lot of uncertainty for the manufacturing sector, whether the manufacturing jobs are still going to be there. And some people are proposing the UBI as a solution to this. Their argument is that the UBI would empower people to have financial security even when going between jobs. It allows them to have financial security so they're not desperate to take a terrible job. And it redistributes some of the wealth created by automation and gives it back to the people. So it's not just the big companies like Amazon benefiting, but everyone benefiting from the rise of technology. I'll start off with Jeff. Is the UBI a good idea for America?
Just to set a little bit of context, there is a debate within my own party about UBI and whether it makes sense. So the arguments for it tend to be that, it does. If we could replace all the functions of the welfare state and deal with the permanent underclass of people by cutting them a check every month, that would be better than the corruption we find in the food stamp program with the agricultural interests and anybody else who's giving kind of in-kind benefits to the poor. So that's to me, anytime the federal government in particular, but it's also true of states, anytime they want to give an in-kind benefit to people, that is that attracts the vultures, that attracts the vulture bureaucrats who are able to reward their friends and punish their enemies.
And Andrew Yang calls his proposal the freedom dividend. That's something he stresses a lot.
Okay. Well, I'm not a supporter of universal basic income. I do support, and one reason is I think that if your country is in such a state where 10, 15, 20, 25% of the people are in this state of permanent emergency, permanent really despair, where they can't access good jobs, they can't act profitably, they can't make their lives better. I think the game's over. I think Alan and I would agree that that's kind of like a tipping point. You gotta think seriously about what has happened to your country, and it may be time to say, let's do some kind of reset. And I appreciate the fact that the Green New Dealers are saying, look, we need a massive reset because things are going bad.
Yeah.
But let's face it, there's a lot of capitalists like me who are also saying, hey, we do need a massive reset too. So we're in agreement on that. It's just the direction of it. So I don't like the idea that we would create a permanent underclass, because I believe that would also strengthen our permanent overclass. That would strengthen all of the things that I think are bad. Our international footprint, our desire to control people and take away their privacy and surveil them. I mean, people who are getting checks are going to be accountable. Are you going to be figuring out whether they're buying illicit drugs, or they're not buying the right foods? They're buying junk food. This is a serious problem. The American public, wants, at least theoretically in its welfare programs in the past, has wanted some virtue, right? It has wanted to say, we're going to give you this because you need to take advantage of the safety net that we've provided in order to lift yourself up. So historically, that has been the role of welfare. So I'm repeating myself, but I don't like this idea of redistributing money from people who earned it to create and sustain a permanent underclass, because that means you just killed social mobility and economic mobility.
That's a really interesting argument. I'm not sure I agree with all of it. What?
Oh, you'll come around. You'll be coming around.
Okay.
Okay. Because I'm Mr. Fascinating.
All right. My conclusion is, why does this create a permanent underclass? It's given to every citizen.
Well, you certainly don't. Because the people who continue to have their careers and jobs are going to be making more, and they really don't need it. It's like wealthy people who are on Social Security. It's nice to get those Social Security checks, but they've already built up their savings, or they've got inherited money, and so they're going to be, the Social Security doesn't make a lot of difference for them. So the people who are really going to be supportive of this are the people who depend on it, and the people who depend on it are the people who don't have any other source of income, who can't function in the gig economy. They may have health problems. They may have a whole host of reasons why they simply can't function in the way that the work world is evolving. They can't get a good enough education through our overpriced school system. So that's why I believe that this would lead ultimately to, look, the welfare system itself has led to, this is why Bill Clinton was elected, and this is why in some respects he was a successful president, and why a lot of Democrats hate him, because he did do welfare reform. He did say, the Democratic ideal, at least the sort of right of center Democrats, was that, people need to work. People need to, that is a way to achieve, happiness and satisfaction that makes for a prosperous society, that makes for happy people, that just makes for, being able to hand wealth down to your children. I mean, people who are in the permanent underclass who can't save money for the future to help their children. I don't know what would happen to me if I thought that there's no way that I could help my offspring to lead a successful life. And I'm sure Alan is agreeing with that.
You want to let Alan speak?
Yeah, absolutely. So and it's interesting because UBI, so I will say this, the Green Party in its platform, the North Carolina Green Party, as a general rule, does support UBI. This is something that we would fight for. I think that you can't have it by itself. I don't think that it is something that would necessarily fix the things that we think it would, because depending on how it's implemented, of course, it doesn't necessarily level the playing field. It just raises everybody up, right? So I think we need to start by addressing some of the social needs that people have in general. So I think we can start with healthcare, and I'm not pivoting off of this because I want to talk about UBI, but we need to make sure that people have financial stability in healthcare and housing and jobs. And UBI is good as a safety net, but I don't think it's something that's going to work in and of itself to close that gap. And this is one thing I think that's really interesting between, and getting to know Jeff and then knowing what I know about the Green Party. I find it so interesting that a lot of the things that we both favor, if we can shore up those differences, hit the reset button in a way that the Green Party wants to, there are a lot of things that theoretically I think libertarian principles would work quite well, much better than we have in the Democratic and Republican parties in their policies. But with regard to UBI, I think that it does open the door where you have a situation, if you give a family, call it $1,000 a month, $1,200 a month, there will be some corporation out there somewhere that says, hey, for $1,200 a month, you give us your UBI check and we're going to give you everything you need. And there'll be some way of taking advantage of people, whether it's to, scrape their data or to shortchange them to take advantage of that. And they would just be taking that UBI money from people to funnel the money back to some giant corporation. If you think of like a Facebook basket or something like that.
Like rents.
Like payday lenders or something?
Kind of. It would be more like what I'm saying is that
I've never heard of that argument.
So you'd have somebody come in and say, they'd be like vultures, basically. They would, you'd take the same argument that happens with like rent subsidized housing and things like that, where people don't provide a really good product, they just take the money.
Oh, right.
That reminds me of the scenario in the movie where they create a company that creates like permanent work, lifetime work contracts.
Mm-hmm.
Do you remember the name of that movie?
I don't.
In the movie, the people actually turn into horses because they depend only on one company. It's a fascinating movie, but I've never heard of that argument before. Like I could see a scenario where like probably Amazon would offer like,
Amazon is a really good think
Mhm.
about that. Think if you could do your Amazon UBI subscription annually, you pay your $12,000 a year to Amazon, and you get free stuff, to a certain extent. I could see that happening. It's a slippery slope argument, but it's not that far off from where we are today.
All right. Let's move on to the last question, which has more to do with healthcare and social issues, and that is the opioid crisis. So recently, Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren have proposed creating safe sites in the United States. And what these are safe injection sites for heroin addicts to, in a safer way than doing it on the street, inject heroin and get the high they need without turning to dirty needles and without turning to the really dangerous laced stuff. Proponents of this argue that it's going to prevent opioid deaths and it's going to actually funnel people into the therapy and rehab they need. But critics of this argue that it's enabling this epidemic to continue and their addiction to continue. What are your thoughts? I'll let whoever wants to go first. Jeff?
Well, I'll weigh in and then give Alan a chance to be nearly as fascinating as me. Drug use is normal. Substance abuse is normal. I consistently on this campaign and consistently with my party, and I also think the Green Party, we are anti-prohibition. So the question is, well, why are we anti-prohibition? Why do we say that the knee-jerk reaction to ban something because it does harm it leads to bad policy? Now you can go back and you can watch all these mob movies from the out of prohibition to just see it. I mean that sort of makes it very concrete, the history. But why do people continue to still believe that? And I think for the most part, at least in the case of marijuana, 2/3 of the public knows that these policies have repercussions. So I do believe that prohibition leads to controls on the production and the distribution, meaning the prescriptions, right? And that has not made a dent in the problem. So if you start with the Hippocratic Oath, first do no harm, that's where you get harm reduction, right? That's where you get harm reduction policies. You want to eliminate, not eliminate, but you want to continuously improve your means of dealing with death and destruction and despair and people who need actual treatment. Now, you do have to remember that a lot of these this sort of wave of opiate deaths, 2/3, and I looked this figure up because every time it comes into my mind, I think that, well, that can't be true. That can't be true. But it is true. So like 2/3 of these deaths over the last 10 years, they call, deaths related to opioid, but there is a whole cocktail full of other drugs related to this. So the fact is that opiate products, morphine and heroin, people can function on those drugs. Pain management patients need those drugs, and a lot of them need them just to maintain a healthy, normal life. And so you can't punish those people for what, when I was growing up, it was addicts stealing television sets to pay for their habits. So there was all this crazy mythology that was going on. And I'm not saying that people don't commit crimes when they're in a drug-induced haze. People who abuse substances frequently have poor judgment. And I know that from personal and family experience. And I think we all have, basic intuition about the problems of substance abuse. But I totally support these means of harm reduction, whether they're needle exchange, safe injection spaces. I think they have been tried in many places around the world, and I think there are successful models. It is absolutely foolish for the Republicans, the bullying authoritarians of the right, to say that, take a Tylenol and suck it up, then go see your mental health professional that you can't afford anyway because we're not giving you health care. We're not fixing the healthcare system. So I've said enough fascinating things for the moment. I'm going to hand it over.
Which is unfortunate because I'm almost in total agreement here. I mean, I think that what you said makes perfect sense. So I'm for these sites. I think that this is a great way to do it, and I'm against criminalizing this type of behavior. If anything, we need to treat it like a public health crisis and deal with it in that way, not through our criminal justice system. So if we can help, harness this wave and redirect it and use, professionals and
Should we end the stream here?
No, it's just the CIA. It's a false flag. Well, is it real or not? Okay. Okay, we can stay and listen to that freaking buzzing. Okay, so we're just going to, what we're going to do while this annoying sound is in the background is we're going to sing some show tunes. Old Man River. So that was my song.
That's good. Yeah.
What movie should we go see?
I only want to see something that has a strong social message.
Oh, okay. Well, I can't see any movie with Tom Cruise in it because he's like always running. I'm so sick of watching Tom Cruise run in movies. So there's no looking at his Fitbit.
He's got to get his steps in, even when he's on camera. He's got to get those steps.
Yeah.
So anyway, we're just waiting for this silly buzzing to end. I mean, if you want to try to talk over it, I guess.
I mean, that was the last question, so we could wrap it up here.
I think so. I mean, because I'm in agreement with what you said.
Yeah. So we were talking about prohibition. So let's go ahead and wrap it up. Let me wrap up my thing and let Alan have the last word, and then you can have the last word and say bid if on to you. How's that? Okay. So these were really in-depth questions. Some of them we could go on an hour on each of them. I think the Green New Deal probably deserves its own hour, its own episode. Yeah. But appreciate you for taking the time to watch, and especially appreciate Roman holding us to task. I wish the Observer and WBTV had intrepid reporters who would dig deep into the recesses of my fascinating mind, but they're not going to do it. So, Alan?
I would like to dig deep into the recesses of your fascinating mind.
There you go.
I really appreciate having these types of questions to dig into because they're not standard questions. They get us off of our talking points. They make us think about things, and they kind of show the nuance between our campaigns and within our campaigns. So I definitely appreciate this opportunity. And I'll hand it over to Rome.
Roman, you can wrap it up.
All right.
Take us home, Roman.
Well, it's been a pleasure talking to both of you guys. Thank you to our listeners, our audience, and well, that's it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, we will end the stream. End stream.
All right.
How long was it? How long did we go?
Probably an hour, I think, right?
Yeah, 50.